The kitchen was dark except for the lantern on the counter. It was past 11. Everyone was asleep. I could hear the wind pushing against the window glass, and somewhere down the hall, my youngest made a small sound. Not crying, just breathing hard in a dream. I stood there holding a glass of water. I hadn't drunk yet. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Instead, I was very still. And I knew, the way you know something before your mind catches up, that I was about to change something. My name is Rebecca. This is Amish Rebecca, where I share the stories I carried in silence for years. If something in this video stays with you, I'd ask you to subscribe. It means more than you know. And in the comments, I want to ask you something. I'll get to it at the end. That night, I was 34 years old, and I had 6 children. The youngest was 8 months. The oldest was 11. Between them, there had been a miscarriage I didn't talk about, a labor that lasted almost 2 days, and one winter where I was so tired I fell asleep standing at the kitchen sink with my hands still in the water. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it so you understand where I was standing when I stood in that kitchen. Not at the beginning of something. Not in the middle. Somewhere much further along than I had admitted to myself. The lantern light made everything amber. The wooden floor was cold through my socks. Outside, the fields were completely dark. No streetlights, no passing cars. Just the particular silence of a plain community at night, which is a different kind of silence than most people know. It sits on you. It expects things from you. I had grown up inside that silence, and I had loved it, mostly. But that night it felt like a hand on my chest. Not violent. Just present. Pressing. I set the glass of water on the counter and looked at it for a long time without drinking. I had not told anyone what I was thinking. Not my mother. Not my closest friend, Hannah, who lived 3 farms down and who had 7 children of her own, and who I loved like a sister. Not my husband, Eli. Especially not Eli. What I was thinking didn't have clean edges. It wasn't a decision yet, it was more like a knowing that kept surfacing and that I kept pushing back down. The knowing was this. I could not do it again. Another pregnancy. Another year of my body belonging entirely to something else. I could not. And I was afraid of how certain that felt. In our community, children were not a burden. They were the opposite of a burden. They were evidence of faithfulness, of God's blessing, of a woman who had given herself fully to her family and her people. The Ordnung, the set of rules and understandings that shaped our daily life, didn't spell out how many children a family should have. But the culture did. Large families were respected. Large families were loved. A woman who struggled with that idea was a woman who was struggling with something inside herself that needed prayer, not permission. I had believed this. For a long time, I had believed it completely. My mother had 8 children. She never once, in my entire childhood, said she was tired. I don't mean she never looked tired. She did, sometimes, around her eyes late at night. I mean she never said it. Not to us. Not in a way that asked anything in return. Submission wasn't something she talked about either. It was just the shape of her life. The way a riverbed is the shape of the water that's always run through it. I learned from watching her that a good woman carries what she's given and doesn't catalog the weight. I was 34 years old before I questioned whether that was wisdom or just grief with no name. The 4th pregnancy had been the hardest physically. I won't go into the details, they're mine to keep, but there was a week in the 7th month where I wasn't sure I was going to come through it the way I wanted to. Eli sat with me every evening that week. He read to me from the Bible, the Psalms mostly, in that low, careful voice he used when he didn't know what else to give. He held my hand when I finally slept. I want you to understand this about him before I tell you the rest. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been handed a world, just as I had, and who had accepted it, just as I had, and who had never thought to question whether the world had been handed to him correctly. 3 Sundays before that night in the kitchen, a woman in our district announced her 7th pregnancy after the church meal. Her name was Mary. She was 31. The women around her made the sounds women make, soft sounds, warm sounds, hands reaching for her arm. I made them too. I stood there, and I smiled, and I said what I was supposed to say. And then something strange happened. The feeling I expected, The warmth, the recognition, the shared belonging, it didn't come. There was just a hollow place where it should have been. I stood in that circle of women, and I felt nothing. And the nothing frightened me more than any feeling would have. I walked home that afternoon, and I told myself it was tiredness. I told myself I was being selfish, which is one of the worst things a woman in my community could be. I told myself to pray about it. I did pray about it. But the hollow place didn't fill. It just sat there, quiet and patient, the way a true thing sits when it knows you'll eventually have to look at it. That night, not the night in the kitchen, but this earlier night, Hannah said something to me as we washed up after the meal. She said, quietly, almost to herself, "I wish someone would ask us." She didn't say anything more. I didn't ask her what she meant. But I know now. I understood it then, too, even though I pretended I didn't. Some words you hear with your whole body, not just your ears. Morning came the way it always did, sudden and full. The baby needed feeding. The older children needed breakfast. Boots by the door, coats on hooks, the smell of oatmeal and wood smoke and cold air coming in every time someone opened the back door. Eli was moving through the kitchen behind me, getting ready for the day, pulling on his coat. I had been awake since 5. I had rehearsed nothing. I want to be clear about that. There was no prepared speech, no careful wording I had worked out in the dark. There was only the knowing that had been sitting in me for weeks, and the understanding that today I was going to stop pretending it wasn't there. I turned from the counter, and I said his name. Just that. He stopped. Something in the way I said it, maybe too quiet, too still, against all that morning noise. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you already sense the ground is about to shift, but you can't yet tell which direction. I said, "I need to tell you something." The baby was in the other room. One of the older children called out about a missing mitten. The world kept going, loud and ordinary, and inside it I said the thing I had never said to anyone. I told him I could not have another child. Not wouldn't. Could not. He didn't speak. Not right away. I had expected anger, not violence. Eli was never that, but the particular quiet anger of a man who has been told something that doesn't fit inside his understanding of how things are. That didn't come either. What came instead was something I hadn't prepared for. His face changed in a way I can only describe as lost. Not hurt, not furious. Lost. Like I had said something in a language he recognized the sounds of, but couldn't fully translate. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor. The mitten was found. Someone laughed down the hall. The oatmeal was starting to stick. He said slowly, "Rebecca, the ordnung doesn't say." And then he stopped. I think he was going to tell me that this wasn't forbidden, that there was no rule against a woman expressing what she needed. And he was right technically. But that wasn't what I needed him to understand. I said, "I know. I'm not asking permission." My voice was calm. I don't know where that calm came from. I hadn't felt calm in months. "I'm telling you," I said, "because you should know." There was a pause that felt much longer than it was. Then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door, and he walked outside, and the day began, and nothing looked different from the outside at all. He went to work. The children went about their morning. I washed the oatmeal pot and hung the dish towel, and nursed the baby in the chair by the window, looking out at the yard where the light was coming in gray and flat across the frozen ground. The world had not ended. That was the thing that kept arriving in me, quiet and strange. I had said the most frightening thing I had ever said to my husband, and the sun had still come up, and the children had still needed their mittens, and the oatmeal had still stuck to the pot. I didn't know whether that was a relief or the loneliest feeling I had ever had. For 3 days, Eli and I moved around each other carefully. He wasn't cold, he spoke to me, he helped with the children, he passed me things at dinner. But there was a space between us where something usually lived, and it was empty. No one in our community knew. This was not the kind of thing that left the house. And that privacy, which I had always understood as protection, felt different now. It felt like the two of us were standing inside a room with no door, and neither of us quite knew how to say so. I thought about Hannah. I wondered if she had rooms like this too. I wondered how many women I knew were living quietly inside spaces no one could see. On the 3rd evening, after the children were in bed, Eli came and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He didn't have his Bible. He didn't have anything in his hands. He sat for a moment in the way he sometimes did when he was working something out. Then he looked at me and he said, plainly and without decoration, "You're tired." Not a question, just a recognition. 2 words. And I want to tell you, that was not everything. It was not an answer. It was not a promise. It did not solve the thing that existed between us or the larger thing that existed around us both. But it was true. And he had seen it. I held those 2 words all night like something small and worth keeping. I still think about Hannah's words. I wish someone would ask us. I understand now that she wasn't waiting for a question. She was waiting for permission to stop waiting. And I think that's what that morning in the kitchen was, finally, for me. Not bravery. Not rebellion. Just the quiet end of waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right version of myself that would be acceptable enough to speak. If you have ever stood in a place like that, somewhere between what you know and what you're allowed to say, then you already understand everything I've tried to tell you. You didn't need to be stronger. You just needed to be a little more tired of your own silence than you were afraid of breaking it. That's all it ever takes. Just that much. And sometimes, in the right moment, that's exactly enough. If something in this story stayed with you, leave 1 word in the comments. Just 1. I'll read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, you know what to do. I'll be here.